You're at a university, do you tell people to go into journalism, or do you tell people to go into communications?
Well, see, I'm
What are you
an
gonna
odd
do?
I'm an odd voice in that sense because I was an English major. I don't particularly believe in journalism. Now, of course, it could be applying for a job in a journalism department next week, in which case I repudiate all that. But I think you get a good, well-rounded liberal education to go into any field, including journalism. I don't really understand why you need a journalism major. There are things you can learn very quickly on a job, depending on what it is. So I would advise people to go into anything that's going to give them that breadth of knowledge. History, of course, you have to have. And a lot of this sounds like boilerplate. I saw an interview with Katie Couric or one of these muckety-mucks once, and just, oh, read everything you can, and all this sort of general advice. What people really want to know is specifically, how do you get that first job? It's all well and good to say, dabble here, dabble there, major in philosophy, major in Greek, fine. But are you going to be able to then to walk into the Wall Street Journal and get a job? Those questions aren't quite as critical now because of these different routes that I mentioned. You can start your own blog. If you create a blog and the world comes around to it, then you have recreated the form right in your own living room or your parents' basement, as it were. So that to me is just incredibly exciting. There was just one road before, and if that wasn't the road you wanted to travel, too bad for you. And now it's a whole horizon's worth of options.
Okay. Well, that's a very positive way of looking at the journalistic field.
Well, and
these
that's
days,
what
I think.
I get that from Gatling. I mean, you have to be an optimist when you look at these 19th century entrepreneurs who would start out every day. They had tremendous odds against them. Like Gatling, they would make a fortune, lose a fortune, make a fortune, lose a fortune. I mean, the swings were wild, but they persevered. They kept going. And as I quote in the book, William Dean Howells, a wonderful American novelist, called it that American poetry of vivid purpose. There is something particularly American about that just off you go again, and no harm and no shame in failing, because it only means you're on your way to success. And that kind of optimism, it's really contagious. You read about these 19th century guys and you think, darn it, they may have been onto something.
What's the best part about being a writer?
I don't really feel any choice in the matter. So I don't really, it's just what I've always done from the time I was a kid. So I never really thought, this is what I will do. It might have been better if I had not been able to get that first job, and then I'd be doing something that would maybe be more helpful and more reputable in the world. But I think it's, Tennessee Williams' great line, if you can do something else, do it. Only be a writer if you think there's nothing else you really can do.
What's the worst part about being a writer?
Oh, I think in that the constant self-evaluation that always precedes the world's evaluation. You are constantly evaluating yourself as well. I mean, I wish I could be like Stephen King apparently is. He's written about this so eloquently, that in his early days, just sitting in the corner, and they had a bunch of little kids around, he and his wife living in a small cramped trailer. He'd had no success. He was a nobody from nowhere, but he just keeps writing because he has this great passion to do it. I wish I were that way. I'm afraid once you have put your work out there to be judged, it's very, very difficult. You have to learn. You don't want to be, I don't want to say iron-hided, because that's not right either. You need to listen to other people. Critiques are important.
Right.
There are people that I will submit my work to and say, what do you think? And they're very honest with me. If they said every time, this is great, what good would that do me?
Yeah.
So you have to be able to listen to other people, but to get that precise calibration of when to listen and when to think, no, I'm going to go my own way. So those are kind of learning how to deal with things. They're, in effect, mechanical skills that go along with the creative and aesthetic task of art, of creating art. And I think it's all art, even nonfiction. It doesn't often get the reputation for that, but it is.
It's funny you mentioned Stephen King, because I think he was saying at the same time that he was doing that, he was a pretty heavy drinker.
You're right.
And so
That's been my, yeah.
that's the
always
problem.
wanted to-
That's the next step. What's the best writing job you've had? What's your most favorite?
Oh, probably being television critic at the Columbus Dispatch. That's
Really?
the job I had right before I left Columbus. Yeah, I'd kind of taken it on a whim for myself. I wanted to be a critic, but I frankly was kind of bored with the traditional genres. I didn't really want to be a literary critic. I thought that was kind of over. Movie critic, I thought it would really spoil my time at the movies. So nothing really interested me. But television, I've always been fascinated by television. It's our national repertory theater. It's so vastly, of course, informed by economics because there's so much money to be made in it. There's a story about in the 50s when they first realized how much money could be made in television. And it was this, suddenly off went opera, off went all these wonderful lectures and everything, and in came The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy and all that. And more power to them. I mean, I love television at its best. And I can be amused by it and appalled by it at its worst, but it's never less than interesting, and I loved writing about it.
What's the worst writing job you've had?
Oh, I have to say, and this is absolutely necessary, you must do it. My early days of the Columbus Dispatch was covering cops in courts, is what they call it. You're working the late nights, you make the police calls, which means you sit there and you go down a list of cities and suburban police departments and fire departments. You call them and say anything going on. And occasionally they say, yeah, we had 4 people die and an accident out on Route 23. We'll get the names to you in a minute. Because, again, it's human misery. The only story you're writing about is human misery. If they'd said, yeah, it's really cool here tonight. We just had a guy who won a horseshoe tournament, and it's really sweet because he just returned from a medical leave, and we're all real happy. Like, yeah, thanks, click. I mean, you're only interested in the bad.
You're the second journalist that's told me the same thing.
Really? I'm not original, as I thought.
No, that's the calling the cops is always the worst thing for a
Yeah.
journalist. Everybody hates it.
But that said, writing stories about crimes is among the best things you can do. If it's not just the routine calls, where you really cut your teeth and learn how to write a story, is on those kinds of stories, because everyone's going to be interested. There's going to be a lot of attention on it, and they're so formulaic that the effort to break out of that formula makes you a better writer and a more creative writer.
What was the worst job that was good preparation for being a writer? Do you have something in your formative years that you look back? And I think you've already mentioned the police stuff.
Yeah, I think beyond journalism, my first jobs, my grandfather ran a wholesale frozen food business in Huntington, West Virginia. That's where I'm from, born and raised there. And one of my jobs was just to staple together the bulletins of each week's items that he would be for sale, like bulk French fries and bulk hamburger meat and this kind of thing. The most boring, awful job you can imagine, but it gave me a lot of time to listen to everybody else in the rest of the office. So one thing those kinds of jobs do, those kind of rote, mindless jobs, it gives your mind, of course, a free vista across which to gamble, and we all do it. And that's where, really, I think the stories are born, in those idle moments.
What genre haven't you written that you'd like to try? What's something else? You've gone fiction, nonfiction. Is there a subgenre of either category?
Well, I always thought I would be a playwright. I wrote plays when I was young, and I really thought that's where my destiny was going to emerge. And it's funny how you do when those times when you think you have a destiny. Now I think we all just kind of muddle along, buffeted by various events. But I still do write plays and such, and I've just finished a thriller that I just sent to my agent that I hope will be published soon. I really like entertaining stories, mystery stories, those sorts of subgenres of fiction. I try to really read widely. I write a literary column each week for the Tribune, and one of my goals in that is to really cover the waterfront, graphic novels and poetry and nonfiction and fiction and thrillers and mystery, as well as, of course, all the requisite serious fiction of the day. I think that's very important, not to get kind of stuck in this kind of highbrow rut, which sometimes people will expect that from me. They hear about the PhD in English and they think, she's going to be writing about Roth and Toni Morrison and all that. And instead I'm off writing Stephen King and Dan Simmons.
Well, that's great, because my next question is usually, what's your secret vice of an author or a genre? What writer or area would surprise people to know that you read? But it looks like you've thrown it all out there. If we've covered graphic novels, and
Yes,
there's really no shame left now.
I love
really.
comic books. I loved them as a kid. My happiest moments were getting on my bike. I knew the day the new DC Comics came out. I was always a DC person, not so much Marvel. I came late to Marvel, but DC Comics. And I would pedal furiously down to the drugstore and buy the latest DC Comics. I mean, I had a huge collection. I lived for that day when the comics came out. And I love the trend that graphic novels and comics have taken now, which is kind of embellishing on the superhero genre and moving on into these other realms, really telling us a lot about life. Graphic novels, to my mind, are just stunningly good.
Well, I thank you very much,
thank you,
Julia
Doug,
Keller, for coming and talking to us about it. And again, the books, Mr. Gatling's Terrible Marvel, just out on paperback, and the fiction book is Home
Back
Again.
Home.
Back Home.
Back Home, yes.
Back
A
Home,
compromise title. Was not the title I wanted, but
What was the title you wanted?
I just called it Back. It has kind of a double entendre, the back part of it, and they thought that was far too oblique, and they're probably right.
We'll be looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you.